Storm over the Maritime Bonds. It began with a fleet that never returned. Ships entrusted with precious cargo, timber, grain, metals, textiles, vanished somewhere between familiar shores and open sea. No wreckage washed ashore. No survivors appeared. Only silence drifted back across the waves. Yet the true disaster did not lie beneath the water. It lay in the papers signed months earlier, contracts that bound entire economies to the fate of vessels now lost beyond the horizon. To understand how these maritime bonds gained such power, we must return to a time when the sea was both opportunity and danger. Coastal nations rose on tides of trade, their fortunes tied to fleets that ventured into uncertain waters. Risk was the price of ambition. But risk alone could not fund expansion. So financiers created instruments that transformed peril into profit, agreements that spread the danger of loss across investors hungry for reward. A single voyage could enrich thousands. But when fortune turned, those same bonds could drag nations toward ruin. The first reveal begins with the nature of the lost fleet. These ships were not ordinary cargo vessels. They were part of a bold enterprise financed through layers of bonds, each promising generous returns to merchants, nobles, and even foreign courts. Investors believed the voyage would open new markets, forge new alliances, and deliver riches unmatched by any previous expedition. The excitement was infectious. Even cautious treasurers found themselves persuaded by promises of prosperity. Then came the second beat. As the fleet sailed into distant waters, the bonds began trading across Europe. Their value surged with every rumor of favorable winds, every hopeful report carried by intercepted messages. Markets treated the voyage as a triumph before it even returned. Towns planned expansions. Guilds hired new workers. Governments drafted budgets assuming revenue that had not yet materialized. Confidence swelled so rapidly that few questioned the fragility beneath the surface. But when the expected ships failed to appear at the appointed time, unease crept into markets like a slow, gathering storm. At first, investors dismissed the delay. Seas were unpredictable. Weather could shift without warning. Yet as days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, silence stretched too long to ignore. The value of the maritime bonds wavered. Speculation replaced certainty. And still, no signal came from the fleet's final route. Whispers began to travel from port to port. Some claimed piracy. Others blamed storms. A few insisted the fleet had mutinied and vanished into foreign service. But beneath every theory lay a deeper fear that the entire financial structure built around the voyage was beginning to crack. And as markets trembled, Europe braced for a storm far greater than the one that claimed the ships. The first tremors appeared in the coastal markets. Merchants who once traded maritime bonds with effortless confidence now hesitated, their transactions slowed by doubt. Prices fluctuated violently. Investors demanded updates no one could provide. Every rumor, true or false, sent values soaring or collapsing within hours. Bonds once considered the safest venture of the decade now carried the sharp scent of uncertainty. As the reveal deepened, officials attempted to stabilize the situation. Port authorities released carefully worded statements claiming the fleet had merely altered its route. Financiers urged patience, assuring investors that storms or shifting currents often delayed voyages of such scale. But these reassurances clashed with the private reports circulating behind closed doors. Navigators studying sea charts knew the fleet had passed through a corridor notorious for treacherous weather, rogue currents, and unseen hazards. Weeks of silence in that region rarely ended well. The conflict took its earliest form when a consortium of merchants demanded the bonds be honored regardless of the fleet's fate. Their argument was blunt: investors had taken a calculated risk, and the contracts must be upheld. But the issuing house, the powerful maritime bank behind the venture, insisted that payment depended on the fleet's safe return. Without cargo, their reserves could not cover the promised yields. The disagreement, once a quiet negotiation, soon escalated into a public rift. Across Europe, tension surged as news of the dispute spread. Governments that had invested heavily in the bonds faced sudden budget shortfalls. Guilds that expanded their workshops began cutting hours and canceling contracts. Even distant regions felt the pressure, as trade routes reliant on the expected goods struggled to adjust to shortages. A single lost fleet had become a continental burden. Inside the Maritime Bank, the atmosphere soured. Clerks reviewed ledgers with growing alarm. Executives debated strategies late into the night, aware that their institution stood on the edge of collapse. Records revealed that the bank had sold far more bonds than the fleet's cargo could realistically secure. They had overleveraged the voyage, gambling on perfect conditions and perfect outcomes. Now, without the ships, their entire structure wavered. Matters worsened when a letter arrived from a distant outpost, an uncertain account from a lone fisherman claiming to have seen debris drifting near a remote archipelago. Though unverified, the report ignited panic. Markets plunged. Investors stormed the offices of brokers demanding compensation. Rival states, sensing vulnerability, tightened their own maritime regulations to shield themselves from the spreading uncertainty. Desperation grew when the bank invoked an obscure clause buried deep within the bond contracts. It allowed the institution to delay payments indefinitely during periods of unresolved maritime loss. The clause had been dismissed as a formality never meant for real use. Yet now it became the bank's shield against total collapse. Investors responded with outrage, calling the move a betrayal of trust. The fracture widened as brokers refused to trade the bonds at any price. They declared them toxic, too volatile to touch. What had begun as a voyage of hope had evolved into a crisis of confidence, one capable of dragging entire economies toward the deep. And as fear spread from coastline to capital, all of Europe waited for the answer to a single question: was the fleet gone forever, or was there still a chance, however small, that it might return? Hope flickered briefly when a distant merchant caravan reported seeing sails on the horizon, sails resembling those of the missing fleet. Markets surged for a single day, investors clinging to the possibility of a miraculous return. But the sighting proved false, a misidentified convoy from a neighboring kingdom. The disappointment struck harder than the initial loss, eroding what little confidence remained. In the absence of truth, speculation transformed into fear, and fear into something far more volatile. Conflict erupted openly when investors from 3 rival states filed formal demands for compensation. They argued that the Maritime Bank had concealed the true risks of the voyage, overstated the fleet's capacity, and knowingly sold bonds whose returns depended more on optimism than probability. The bank countered with clauses, conditions, and historical precedent. But the arguments dissolved in the rising fury of merchants whose livelihoods now hung in the balance. Accusations of fraud, misrepresentation, and reckless expansion flooded every court in Europe. The crisis deepened as cities reliant on maritime trade began to feel the shock. Dock workers were dismissed as cargo shipments dwindled. Workshops that had expanded to meet expected demand faced sudden shortages. Grain prices soared in landlocked towns that had counted on supplies from the vanished fleet. Even political alliances trembled, strained by the financial interdependence the bonds had created. The sea had taken the ships, but the consequences spread far inland. Inside the Maritime Bank, panic evolved into paralysis. Senior officials whispered among themselves, each aware that revealing the full truth could trigger riots. Ledgers were analyzed again and again, each recalculation confirming the same grim reality: the bank's reserves could cover only a fraction of the promised payouts. They had gambled aggressively, convincing themselves that the sea would comply with their ambitions. Instead, the water had exposed the fragility beneath their confidence. The build-up accelerated when a confidential report leaked from the bank's inner offices. The document revealed that the fleet had been launched despite warnings from experienced navigators about an approaching weather pattern known for catastrophic storms. Executives had dismissed the concerns, insisting the timing was too valuable to postpone. This revelation ignited outrage. What had been framed as misfortune now took on the shape of negligence, perhaps even reckless disregard for human life and economic stability. Crowds gathered outside the bank's headquarters, demanding restitution and answers. Guards struggled to contain the swelling unrest. Across the region, local councils debated emergency measures to stabilize food prices, shield small merchants, and prevent economic collapse. Tensions rose to the point where a single spark, one speech, one riot, one decree, could unravel centuries of fragile cooperation among maritime nations. Foreign powers seized the moment. Some proposed a joint investigation into the bank's practices, positioning themselves as defenders of transparency. Others, more opportunistic, moved to capture trade routes weakened by the crisis. The disappearance of a fleet had become an opportunity for rivals to redraw influence along the coastline. The final surge in tension came when scholars analyzing oceanic currents reached a grim conclusion. Based on the fleet's route, weather patterns, and timing, survival was no longer likely. No message would come. No ship would return. The bonds, the cargo, the hopes lost to the deep. As this assessment spread across the continent, a heavy stillness settled over its markets and courts. The illusion of uncertainty had vanished. The truth stood stark and immovable. Europe now faced not the fear of loss, but the certainty of it. And with that certainty came the realization that the collapse of the maritime bonds was no longer a question of if, but when. The collapse came with a single declaration: the Maritime Bank, unable to meet its obligations, announced immediate insolvency. The statement, delivered in a trembling voice from the steps of its headquarters, echoed across the continent. Merchants froze mid-transaction. Officials halted meetings. Couriers sprinted toward capitals with messages no ruler wanted to read. The bonds that had once symbolized ambition now represented a failure so vast it threatened to pull entire economies into the deep. The climax unfolded in waves. First came the riots, furious crowds demanding restitution, justice, or simply someone to blame. Then came the political fractures, as creditor states accused one another of negligence and deception. Trade routes collapsed under the strain of uncertainty, leaving coastal towns starving for goods once taken for granted. In some regions, barter returned where currency failed. All because a single fleet, overloaded with hope and recklessness, had vanished into the sea. Yet as the shock pulsed through Europe, a quieter truth emerged. The crisis had not been caused solely by the lost ships. It had been built long before the fleet ever sailed, built in boardrooms where warnings were ignored, in courts where ambition outweighed caution, and in markets eager to believe in profit without risk. The maritime bonds had become a symbol of collective delusion, a reminder that confidence can inflate into catastrophe when no one asks the questions that matter. The resolution began when a coalition of coastal nations convened an unprecedented maritime congress. Rather than assign blame, they focused on rebuilding. New standards for maritime financing were drafted. Future voyages would require diversified insurance, independent oversight, and clear disclosure of risks. A rescue fund was established to support cities devastated by the collapse, financed jointly by states determined never to face such chaos again. The Congress also mandated the creation of an international maritime registry, a transparent ledger of voyages, cargoes, and financial instruments accessible to all trading partners. It was a revolutionary step toward accountability, ensuring that no single institution could ever again gamble with the fate of a continent. As order slowly returned, communities rebuilt their livelihoods. Ports reopened. Merchant fleets sailed once more, cautious but determined. The scars of the crisis remained, but they became lessons etched into policy and memory. And today, as financial systems grow ever more complex, the story of the maritime bonds warns us that uncertainty is not the enemy blind confidence is. The sea will always carry risk. What matters is how we choose to navigate it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.